the untold truth. They came from the sea without warning, longships cutting through the mist, warriors wielding axes and swords, striking coastal villages with terrifying speed. For centuries, Viking raids terrorized Europe, and among the most vulnerable victims were women. But what actually happened to the women captured during these brutal raids? The truth is far more complex than you might imagine. Stay until the end to discover the surprising fates that awaited these captive women, and how some even rose to positions of power. This is the untold story of Viking captives. The age of Viking terror. Between the late 8th and mid-11th centuries, Scandinavian warriors known as Vikings launched devastating raids across Europe. The year 793 AD marked the beginning of this era when Norse raiders attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria, in England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle described the horror. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. For the next 3 centuries, Viking longships would appear along coastlines from Ireland to Constantinople, from the British Isles to the Mediterranean. These weren't mere pirates. They were sophisticated seafarers, traders, explorers, and colonizers who would fundamentally reshape the medieval world. But their reputation as raiders was well-earned. Monasteries, villages, and towns throughout Europe lived in fear of the dragon-prowed ships that brought destruction from the north. The Vikings came from 3 distinct regions: the Danes from Denmark, the Norse from Norway, and the Swedes from Sweden. Each group had slightly different raiding patterns and targets. The Danes focused primarily on England and Francia. The Norse targeted Scotland, Ireland, and the North Atlantic islands. The Swedes ventured eastward into the Baltic and down the river systems of Russia. Their raids followed a pattern. Viking warriors would sail in their shallow draft longships, which could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers. They struck swiftly, typically targeting wealthy but poorly defended locations like monasteries, which housed treasures but lacked military garrisons. The raiders would seize valuables: gold, silver, religious artifacts, livestock, and people, then retreat to their ships before organized resistance could arrive. The economics of captivity. When Vikings raided, they took more than gold and silver. People were valuable commodities in the medieval world, and captives represented a significant portion of Viking plunder. But not all captives faced the same fate. What happened to a captured woman depended on multiple factors: her social status, age, skills, appearance, the specific circumstances of the raid, and the intentions of her captors. The slave trade was a fundamental part of the Viking economy. The Norse word for slave was thrall, and thralls formed the lowest class in Viking society. Historical evidence suggests that slaves comprised approximately 10 to 30% of the Scandinavian population during the Viking Age. This large slave population required a constant supply of new captives, as conditions were harsh, and many slaves did not live long enough to reproduce in significant numbers. Viking traders established major slave markets throughout their territories. Dublin, Ireland, became one of the largest slave trading centers in Western Europe during the 9th and 10th centuries. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts indicate that thousands of captives passed through Dublin's slave markets annually. Other significant slave markets operated in Hedeby in Denmark, Birka in Sweden, and Novgorod and Kiev in the Rus territories. The value of a slave varied considerably based on their characteristics. Young, healthy individuals commanded higher prices. Women with desirable skills, weaving, cooking, or other domestic abilities, were particularly valuable. Beautiful women could fetch premium prices, as could educated captives who could read and write, though literacy was rare in this period. Arabic traveler and diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who encountered Swedish Vikings along the Volga River in 922 AD, described slave markets where captives were displayed and sold. His accounts, though written from an outsider's perspective and containing cultural biases, provide valuable insights into the slave trade practices of the Eastern Vikings. Immediate aftermath of capture. The moment of capture was traumatic and terrifying. Viking raids were violent affairs involving killing, burning, and looting. Women witnessed fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons killed defending their homes. Children were torn from their mothers' arms. The elderly and infirm were often killed immediately, as they had little value and would slow the raiders' retreat. Those selected for capture were typically young and healthy, people who could survive the journey and had value as slaves or ransom. Women faced immediate danger of sexual violence, though historical evidence suggests this was less universal than popular culture depicts. Viking warriors were pragmatic. Damaged goods fetched lower prices at slave markets, and raping captives could also trigger blood feuds or complicate ransom negotiations. However, this pragmatism provided only limited protection. Sexual violence certainly occurred, particularly when raiders didn't intend to sell their captives or when discipline broke down. The threat of violence was a constant tool of control, keeping captives compliant through fear. After the initial capture, women were bound and marched to the Viking ships. The journey itself was perilous. Captives were given minimal food and water, just enough to keep them alive and able to walk or row. Those who couldn't keep pace or who fell ill might be killed or abandoned. Escape attempts were brutally punished, often with death or maiming as a warning to other captives. The sea voyage to Scandinavia or Viking settlements could take days or weeks depending on the destination. Captives were crowded into the ships, exposed to the elements, and given barely enough food to survive. Many died during these voyages from exposure, dehydration, disease, or injuries sustained during capture. The slave markets. Upon arrival in Viking territories, captives were typically taken to slave markets. Here, their fates diverged based on who purchased them and for what purpose. The slave markets were brutal affairs where human beings were inspected like livestock. Buyers examined teeth, checked for diseases, assessed physical strength, and evaluated appearance. Women faced particular scrutiny. Those deemed attractive might be purchased as concubines. Women with visible skills, calloused hands indicating experience with textile work, for instance, attracted buyers seeking domestic slaves. Young women were generally more valuable than older women, as they had more years of labor ahead and could potentially bear children. Prices varied significantly. A healthy adult slave might cost the equivalent of 8 to 12 ounces of silver, a substantial sum in the Viking Age. Beautiful women or those with rare skills could command much higher prices. In contrast, children and the elderly sold for much less. Not all captives went to the slave markets immediately. Some were kept by the raiders themselves, either as personal slaves or as concubines. Others were held for ransom, particularly if they were from wealthy or noble families. Churches and monasteries sometimes paid substantial ransoms to recover captured clergy or valuable members of their communities. Life as a thrall. For women sold into slavery, life as a thrall was harsh and degrading. Thralls had no legal rights in Viking society. They were property, not people. Their masters could beat them, sell them, or kill them with little legal consequence. Female thralls typically performed domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving, grinding grain, tending animals, and any other tasks their masters required. The workday for a thrall was long and exhausting. They rose before dawn and worked until after dark, with minimal rest and poor food. They slept in the worst accommodations, often in the same spaces as livestock. Their clothing was rough and minimal. They received no compensation beyond bare subsistence. Female thralls also faced sexual exploitation. Masters considered sexual access to their female slaves a property right. A thrall woman had no ability to refuse her master's advances, or those of his sons or other male household members. Children born to thrall women inherited their mother's slave status, increasing their master's property. However, within this brutal system, some variations existed. The treatment of slaves depended significantly on individual masters. Some treated their thralls with relative decency, providing adequate food, clothing, and shelter, and refraining from excessive violence. Others were cruel, subjecting their slaves to constant abuse, inadequate provisions, and brutal punishments. Skilled thralls might receive slightly better treatment than unskilled ones, as masters had an economic incentive to keep valuable slaves healthy and productive. A thrall woman who was an exceptional weaver or who possessed other valued skills might be treated better and given slightly less backbreaking work. Concubinage and secondary wives. Another common fate for attractive captive women was to become a concubine or secondary wife. Viking society practiced a form of polygamy, or at least serial monogamy, with concurrent concubines. While a man typically had one primary wife who held legal status and whose children were legitimate heirs, wealthy men often kept additional women as concubines. The distinction between wife and concubine was significant. A wife had legal protections and rights. Her children were legitimate and could inherit. She had status in the household and community. A concubine, however, had limited or no legal protections. Her status depended entirely on her partner's favor. Her children might be recognized but were not legitimate heirs unless specifically acknowledged. For a captive woman, becoming a concubine could be preferable to slavery, but it was still a form of unfreedom. She might live in better conditions than a thrall, wear better clothing, eat better food, and have lighter work duties. However, she remained dependent on her captor's continued interest and goodwill. If he tired of her or died, she might be sold, given away, or enslaved. Some captive concubines, particularly those who bore their captor's children, might eventually gain a measure of security or even freedom. A woman who bore a son for a childless Viking might be valued and protected. Some concubines were eventually freed, especially if they had served faithfully for many years or if their partner developed genuine affection for them. The Icelandic sagas, medieval texts that recount the history and legends of Norse society, contain numerous examples of captive women who became concubines and whose children were acknowledged. While these sagas were written centuries after the Viking Age and contain legendary elements, they reflect actual social practices and possibilities, ransom and release. Not all captured women remained permanently enslaved. Ransom was common, particularly for women from wealthy or noble families. Viking raiders understood that living captives from prominent families could be worth more as ransom than as slaves. The ransom process could take months or even years. Messengers would be sent to the captive's family or community demanding payment for release. Monasteries and churches kept funds specifically for ransoming captives, recognizing this as a charitable duty. Wealthy families would sell land or property to raise ransom for captured relatives. The ransom amounts varied based on the captive's perceived value and the wealth of their family. A noblewoman might be ransomed for hundreds of ounces of silver, while a merchant's daughter might cost significantly less. The negotiation process was complex, often involving intermediaries and careful diplomacy to ensure both payment and the captive's safe return. However, ransom did not guarantee release. Some Vikings reneged on ransom agreements, keeping both the payment and the captive. Others killed captives after receiving ransom as a demonstration of power or in revenge for some offense. The risk was considerable, but many families nonetheless paid ransoms, hoping for their loved one's return. Some women were released without ransom through other means. Vikings who converted to Christianity, and many eventually did, sometimes freed their slaves as an act of piety. Others freed slaves who had served faithfully for many years or in recognition of some particular service or loyalty. Integration and intermarriage. Surprisingly, some captive women were eventually integrated into Viking society, not as slaves, but as wives. This happened through several mechanisms. A captive woman might initially be a concubine or slave, but if she bore children, especially sons, and proved her value to the household, she might be freed and elevated to the status of wife. Genetic studies of modern populations in areas of Viking settlement show clear evidence of intermixing between Scandinavian men and local women. In Iceland, for example, mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited through the mother, shows significant Celtic ancestry, while Y chromosome DNA, inherited through the father, shows predominantly Scandinavian ancestry. This genetic pattern strongly suggests that Viking men took Celtic women, many likely captives, as wives or concubines, and their children became part of Icelandic society. Archaeological evidence also supports this integration. Burials in Viking settlements often include women with grave goods, indicating both Scandinavian and Celtic or Anglo-Saxon cultural influences. These women were buried with honor, suggesting they had achieved respected status in their communities despite likely origins as captives. The Icelandic settlement sagas explicitly mention many founding families having Celtic mothers or grandmothers, often described as thralls or concubines who were eventually freed. While the saga's historical accuracy is debated, they reflect social realities of the Viking Age where captive women could, under certain circumstances, achieve free status and see their children accepted as full members of society. This integration was not universal, and the process was undoubtedly traumatic. These women had been violently torn from their homes, families, and cultures. Even if eventually treated well, they lived among the people who had destroyed their previous lives. The psychological burden of such experiences must have been immense. Women of influence. In rare but documented cases, some captive women rose to positions of genuine power and influence. The most famous example is Melkorka, described in the Laxdæla Saga. According to this saga, Melkorka was an Irish princess captured by Vikings and sold as a slave in Norway. She was purchased by Hoskuld, an Icelandic chieftain, as a concubine. Melkorka initially pretended to be mute, revealing her true identity only after bearing Hoskuld's son, Olaf. Her son eventually traveled to Ireland, discovered his royal heritage, and returned to Iceland as a wealthy and powerful man. Melkorka herself gained status through her son's success. While the historical accuracy of this specific tale is uncertain, it illustrates recognized social pathways by which captive women could gain influence. Other examples exist in the historical record. Some captive women who possessed valuable skills, particularly literacy and education, became valuable advisors. In the eastern Viking territories, where Swedish Vikings established trade routes and settlements, some captive women from the Byzantine Empire or the Islamic world brought knowledge of languages, religion, and culture that proved valuable to their captors. Women who served as interpreters held particularly valuable positions. A captive woman who spoke both her native language and Norse could facilitate trade, diplomacy, and intelligence gathering. Such women might be valued and protected, gaining a measure of autonomy and influence despite their captive origins. The Christian transformation. The gradual Christianization of Scandinavia, which occurred roughly between 950 and 1100 AD, fundamentally altered the treatment of captives. Christian teachings condemned slavery, or at least placed moral obligations on slave owners regarding treatment of slaves. More importantly, the Church actively worked to suppress the slave trade. As Viking kingdoms converted to Christianity, raiding patterns changed. Christian Vikings were less likely to raid other Christian territories, though this prohibition was frequently ignored. The Church pressured Christian rulers to ban the slave trade, with varying success. By the late 11th century, the large-scale Viking raids that had characterized earlier centuries had largely ended. This transformation affected captive women's fate significantly. In Christianized Viking societies, concubinage became less acceptable. Slavery persisted, but under increased moral scrutiny. Freeing slaves became an act of Christian charity encouraged by the Church. While these changes occurred gradually and incompletely, they marked a significant shift from earlier practices. Archaeological evidence. Modern archaeology has provided valuable insights into the lives of captive women. Skeletal remains from Viking-age settlements sometimes show evidence of trauma consistent with violent capture. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth can reveal where individuals grew up and whether they migrated or were forcibly moved during their lives. Several burials in Scandinavian territories contain women whose isotope signatures indicate they originated in the British Isles or other raiding targets. Some of these women were buried with honor, suggesting they achieved respected status despite probable origins as captives. Others show evidence of hard labor and poor nutrition, consistent with slavery. DNA evidence from Viking Age remains confirms the presence of British, Irish, and other non-Scandinavian women in Viking settlements. These genetic studies support historical accounts of captive taking and provide evidence of intermarriage between Vikings and captive women. Recent excavations have also revealed the locations of some slave markets. Archaeological investigations in Dublin, Hedeby, and other trading centers have uncovered buildings and artifacts associated with the slave trade, including shackles, chains, and holding pens. The lasting impact. The Viking practice of capturing and enslaving women had profound effects that extended far beyond individual tragedies. The constant raids and threat of captivity influenced settlement patterns in raided territories. Communities moved inland or built fortifications. Economic activity was disrupted. Social structures adapted to cope with the constant threat. The genetic legacy remains visible in modern populations. Significant portions of people in Iceland, the Scottish Islands, parts of Ireland, and other areas of Viking settlement carry genetic markers from both Scandinavian men and women from raided territories. These genetic patterns tell a story of violence and forced integration that shaped populations for generations. The cultural impact was similarly significant. The Norse language influenced English, Irish, Scottish, and other languages in territories where Vikings settled. Cultural practices intermixed. New hybrid cultures emerged in areas of Viking settlement, particularly in Iceland, the Scottish Islands, and parts of Ireland and England, blending Scandinavian and local traditions. The complex truth. The fate of women captured by Vikings was neither simple nor uniform. Some lived and died as brutally exploited slaves, working in terrible conditions until death brought release. Others were sold for profit at slave markets, their ultimate fates unknown. Some were held for ransom and eventually returned home, though forever marked by their experiences. Others became concubines or secondary wives, living in conditions better than slavery but still unfree. A few, through bearing children, gaining their captor's affection or demonstrating valuable skills, eventually achieved freedom and even respected status. The rarest few rose to positions of genuine influence, their children becoming prominent members of Viking society. What remains consistent across all these varied fates is the initial violence and trauma of capture. These women were violently seized from their homes, families, and cultures. They witnessed terrible things and endured experiences that would mark them forever. Even those who eventually achieved good outcomes had survived profound trauma and loss. The captives who changed history. The story of Viking captives is ultimately about human resilience in the face of terrible circumstances. These women, torn from everything they knew, somehow survived. Some found ways to adapt, to build new lives from the ruins of their old ones. Their children and descendants became part of the societies that had victimized them, contributing to the genetic, cultural, and linguistic makeup of medieval Europe. The Viking Age eventually ended. The Great Raids ceased. Scandinavia became Christianized and integrated into European civilization. The slave trade was suppressed, but the legacy of those violent centuries persisted in the populations, cultures, and genetics of Europe. What surprises you most about what happened to Viking captives? Do you think any modern historical parallels exist? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this deep dive into Viking history revealing, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from the medieval world.